Today we are looking at a case from the first part of the 20th century. So sit back, as for the first time on this channel, we go to Malaysia. British Malaya loosely describes a set of states on the Malay Peninsula and the island of Singapore that were brought under British control between the late 18th and the mid-20th century. However, Malaya was never colonised. The rulers of the Malay states maintained sovereignty. Britain was only in control of the administration. Nevertheless, Malaya was very important to Britain. By the end of the 19th century, the Malay states produced more than half of the world's tin, and by the early 20th century, was also the world's largest natural rubber producer. During this period, the British set up schools, many of which were attended by the sons and daughters of British soldiers, government officials, and employees of large British companies. And some of these schools were very prestigious. Mr. William Proudlock worked in one such school, the renowned Victoria Institute for Boys, a secondary school that was founded in 1893. William joined the staff in 1901 when he was still only 20 years old. He had been personally asked to teach there by the headmaster, Mr. Bennett E. Shaw, when the gentleman had been on a mission to recruit staff while on home leave in England. The school was in Kuala Lumpur, which at the time was a relatively new city, estimated to have been established in 1857 as an important site for the tin industry. It quickly grew, and by 1887 had become the capital of the province of Selangor. In 1896, Kuala Lumpur became the capital of the recently formed Federal Malay States. The city's population quickly increased, mainly due to the rapidly expanding rubber industry, which by the early 1900s was in much demand, as rubber was needed for tyres for the new automobile industry. Kuala Lumpur attracted many businessmen and merchants, many of whom needed to find good schools for their children. William Proudlock married 19-year-old Ethel Charter in April 1907 at the city's St Mary's Church. They had a quiet, understated ceremony, despite the fact that in the early 20th century, an expat wedding was often the cause of lavish celebrations. Instead of wearing a traditional white dress, Ethel chose to wear an electric blue one. Within an hour of the reception, the happy couple had set sail for England on their honeymoon. Many speculated that the reason for this was that she was trying to hide the fact that she was pregnant. Even in the Edwardian era, it was frowned upon for a young lady to be pregnant before being married. Ethel, however, was not the typical expatriate. She was in fact illegitimate, following a relationship between her father and a local woman. On her birth certificate, Mr. Robert Charter was named as her father, but there was no mother listed. She was raised by her father and his wife. However, Mrs. Charter seemed to resent Ethel and never accepted her as her child. After 9 months in England, the couple returned to Kuala Lumpur. It was now January 1908, and it seemed that all the speculation that had surrounded the couple's marriage was probably correct, as whilst away, Ethel had given birth to a daughter, who they named Dorothy. William continued to work in the school and progressed to the position of deputy headmaster. He lived with his family in an area known as Brickfields. However, in the year 1910, when Mr. Bennett Shaw returned to England, William was given the role of acting headmaster, and along with his wife and daughter, moved into the headmaster's bungalow. This was a large single-storey wooden building with a veranda that surrounded it. At the back was the Klang River, and at the front was a 5-foot high hedge. It was located at one end of the school playing field, which was situated between the bungalow and a very busy street. Fortunately, this was far enough away that the Proudlocks were not disturbed by the noise. The days were hot and humid. As the climate was tropical, there were no distinct seasons, and very little variation in temperature. April 1911 was a particularly hot period. The sun would shine most of the day, with the occasional shower. Ethel, however, was used to the weather. She often stayed at home while William was at work, and was assisted by her servants, who lived behind the property. On the evening of the 23rd of April 1911, Mr. William Proudlock attended a dinner with another member of staff, leaving his wife Ethel at home in the bungalow. That night, however, Ethel received a visitor, a 34-year-old bachelor named William Crozier Stewart. Mr. Stewart was a mining consultant and former manager of the Salak South tin mine. That day he had visited a rubber estate, but had declined an invitation to dine stating that he had an important appointment in Kuala Lumpur. Later he dined with a friend, but left at 9 p.m, again stating that he had an appointment. He travelled to the Proudlock residence by rickshaw. This was a common mode of transport in Asia in the early 1900s, and a form of employment for male labourers. A rickshaw is a 2 or 3 wheeled passenger cart that is pulled by one person. Generally, only one passenger travelled in a rickshaw at a time. When the rickshaw arrived at the bungalow, Mr. Stewart requested that the boy wait behind the hedge, while he stopped for a quick visit. He said that he would soon be out, and would need to be taken back into the city. A few minutes later, the boy heard gunshots. He then saw Mr. Stewart stumble down the steps and collapse onto the ground. His lower body was on the driveway, and his upper body was lying on the grass. As the boy looked in silence, he saw a lady approach. She had a gun in her hand, scared of what might happen to him. The boy ran off in the direction of the gates. As he did, he heard 4 more shots. One of Mrs. Proudlock's servants heard the noise and rushed to see what was happening. When they saw Mrs. Proudlock with a revolver in her hand, they immediately sent for the lady's husband, Mr. William Proudlock. He quickly returned and found his wife in a state of shock, sitting on the veranda. The police also arrived. They found Mr. Stewart's body about 20 or 30 paces from the bungalow. He had been shot through the heart. A subsequent post-mortem conducted by Dr. Cooper, the chief medical officer at the General Hospital, discovered 5 other bullet wounds in the back of Mr. Stewart's neck, jaw and skull. Mrs. Ethel Proudlock was arrested and charged with murder. The trial sparked great interest, both in Malaya and in Great Britain. The young rickshaw driver gave evidence. He told of how he had heard gunshots. He then saw Mrs. Stewart stumble down the steps and collapse onto the ground. He confirmed that it was a defendant who he had seen looking down at Mr. Stewart. He said that he then ran off, and as he did, he heard 4 more shots. Mrs. Proudlock's husband, Mr. William Proudlock, told the court that when he returned home that evening, he found his wife very distressed, with blood on her cheek and her dress. He said that he asked her what had happened, and she replied that Mr. Stewart had arrived, as he said that he wanted to retrieve a book. When she had gone to fetch it, he encircled her and attempted to assault her. He added that his wife was on the veranda, which was in some disorder, and that she was speaking in a very incoherent manner. Mrs. Ethel Proudlock gave evidence in her own defence. She told the court that Mr. William Stewart arrived at the schoolhouse, and after a brief exchange of pleasantries, he attempted a gross familiarity. He then said, "You lovely girl," and "I love you," along with some other outrageous words. A struggle ensued, and Mr. Stewart turned off the light. Mrs. Proudlock said that she attempted to reach for the light switch, but instead came across her husband's revolver. She said that she fired once, not to try and kill the gentleman, but to be clear of him. Mrs. Proudlock added that after this, she has no memory of what happened, and she only came around when she was on the veranda, holding the revolver. She immediately threw it down and asked one of her servants to call her husband, who was dining out with a friend. When he returned, Mrs. Proudlock said that she shouted, "Blood, blood, I have shot a man." She said that the shooting of Mrs. Stewart was done solely in self-defence. During the trial, it was pointed out by the prosecution that Mr. William Stewart was shot on the veranda, indicating that he was leaving the bungalow at the time. Furthermore, he had asked the rickshaw boy to wait for him, so he clearly didn't expect to be there for very long. But this wasn't all the prosecution brought to light. They claimed that the defendant, Mrs. Ethel Proudlock, and the deceased gentleman, Mr. William Stewart, were in fact lovers. They claimed that Mrs. Proudlock was a difficult and hysterical lady, and that as William Stewart had started a relationship with a Chinese woman, he had come to the bungalow that night to end the affair. Mrs. Proudlock had then murdered him in a jealous rage. The press came up with a number of different theories, speculating that Mrs. Proudlock may have invited Mr. Stewart to the bungalow that night with the sole purpose of murdering him. Or perhaps he had indeed gone there to officially end the relationship, as the prosecution stated, and so outraged that he would do such a thing, she shot him. They also put forward the idea that perhaps Ethel had a second lover who was at the bungalow when William arrived, and who was responsible for shooting him. Ethel then took the blame for it. The press suggested this mystery man may have swam across the river behind the bungalow to escape detection. However, it is questionable whether this could have happened. It was night time, and the river was full of crocodiles. To swim across it would have been very risky, and the chances of making it to the other side alive would have no doubt been very low. However, Ethel refuted all these claims. She maintained her innocence and denied any suggestion that she may have been involved in an improper relationship with Mrs. Stewart. She only said that she shot him to protect her honour. There was no jury, and the case was heard by a judge and 2 assessors. The trial lasted for 10 days, and on the 22nd of June 1911, the judge found Mrs. Ethel Proudlock guilty of the murder of Mr. William Stewart. The judge said that there were inconsistencies in her testimony, and other circumstantial evidence pointed to her intentionally murdering the gentleman. He then sentenced her to death. The verdict was widely reported, but was overshadowed as on the same day, King George V was crowned King of the United Kingdom and the British Dominions and Emperor of India in a ceremony that took place at Westminster Abbey in London. However, many people in the local community were very angry with the judge's decision, resulting in the newspaper, the Malay Mail, to issue the following notice: "We decline to associate ourselves with the hysterical outbursts which have followed the judicial decision. Correspondence has already appeared in our columns touching upon the case, and the opinions of our readers will receive publicity within limits. But for those of you who have gone to all kinds of adjectival extremes in order to attempt to splutter forth their wrath against the judge and assessors, it may be added that their effusions will find the oblivion of the waste paper basket." Ethel Proudlock was sent to the Poudre prison to await her execution. In 1911, this was considered a relatively modern building. It had been built in phases by the British colonial government between 1891 and 1895. The cells were small and dark, each equipped with a window, which was the size of a shoebox. As the weeks passed, the opinion amongst the local residents seemed to be that Mrs. Proudlock had been treated harshly by the judge. They believed that she had acted in self-defence while defending her honour and called for her to be pardoned. Her husband, Mr. William Proudlock, wrote a number of letters demanding her release. In many of these, he criticised the Selangor government for the unfair way in which they had conducted the trial. He insisted that not only was the legal system defective, but there were also issues with the way in which the crime had been investigated. He criticised the Chief Commissioner's conduct and insisted that the gentleman had been entering the Selangor Club, telling everyone that Mrs. Proudlock would be strung up. Certainly not a very good example of a member of the law enforcement acting in an impartial manner. Mr. Proudlock also claimed that his servants had been beaten by the police as they did not answer their questions in a way that would incriminate his wife. But despite this, Ethel remained in prison, awaiting her appeal. During this time, several petitions were started, asking for her to be pardoned. These included one from her husband and the boys who attended the Victoria Institute. On Saturday, the 8th of July 1911, against the advice of British advisers, the Sultan granted Mrs. Ethel Proudlock a pardon on the condition that she leave Malaya. She immediately left for England with her daughter. William Proudlock was sued by the police for libel, as he had insisted that they had beaten his servants when they would not agree to give incorrect evidence against his wife. He lost the case and lost his teaching position. He then returned to England. However, he continued to fight, writing many letters to the Colonial Office, criticising the investigation into the events of the 23rd of April 1911 and the terrible treatment of his wife. William believed that she had only been prosecuted as she was Eurasian, and if she had been born to a British mother and a British father, the case would never have gone to trial. William and Ethel did not live in England for very long. They moved to Canada in 1913, but did not stay together. 3 years later, Ethel moved to the United States. In 1931, William accepted a job at St. George College in Argentina. He died in 1958 at the age of 77. In 1944, Ethel remarried, and in 1950 moved to Florida, where she died in 1974 at the age of 88. Her daughter Dorothy eventually settled in Miami, where she died in 1990, aged 83. She never married or had any children. In the 1920s, writer Somerset Maugham heard about the case of Ethel Proudlock from her lawyer and decided to write a fictional version of it, called The Letter. The story was later adapted into a play and then a film. Following this, the incident at the headmaster's bungalow on the 23rd of April 1911 was largely forgotten about and never talked about in the Victorian Institutes. That was until 1999, when a book titled Murder on the Veranda and written by Eric Lawler was published. In 1957, Malaya became independent and was known as the Independent Federation of Malaya. In 1963, the federation was renamed Malaysia. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case